Hello, and welcome to another episode of Roots and Hoots, a podcast project produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation. Since 2020, we have been gathering, laughing, learning hard truths, and sharing in community conversations with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Each episode, we learn something new, and we're excited to be sharing this journey with you. Roots and Hoots is about connecting with and celebrating Indigenous peoples' contributions to their fields of study, work, and cultures. We also speak with allies who share how they are furthering the work of reconciliation in Canada. To learn more about the Legacy of Hope Foundation and the work that we do, please visit legacyofhope.ca.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Roots and Hoots. In this episode, host Gordon Spence is thrilled to be joined by historian, scholar, and associate head of the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Sean Carleton. In this powerful conversation, Sean speaks with Gordon about being an ally and co-conspirator with Indigenous peoples, the importance of non-Indigenous Canadians' role in confronting residential school denialism, and his connection with Katsi'tsakwas Ellen Gabriel, which led to the release of their book, When the Pine Needles Fall, Indigenous Acts of Resistance. We hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please visit our website and show notes to learn more about the topics covered.
Yes, Sean, it's good to have you, and thank you for doing this.
Absolutely.
It's always good to talk to people from Manitoba, especially.
Thank you.
Okay, well, hello and welcome to this podcast episode of Roots and Hoots, produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation. Today, our guest is Sean Carleton, an associate professor in the Departments of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. Maybe Sean, hello, John. Sean, how are you? Welcome.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Maybe just start by telling us about a little bit about your background, like where you're from and your nationality and your family, your community, where you grew up, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my name is Sean Carleton. I'm a settler Canadian, originally of Irish and English origin. My working class family first settled on the prairies before moving out to the West Coast, where I was born and raised, a place called North Vancouver, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Coast Salish nations. And I think, I work with students and talk about the importance of sort of positioning yourself, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, understanding your own family's history as part of this larger process. And so something that I try to model is we see a lot of Canadians try and lop off their history as a way of sort of denying or clouding the kind of colonial history that Canada is very much a part of. And I think talking about that family connection, that family history is important for non-Indigenous people to position themselves as newcomers to these lands. It helps, I think, in the relationship building work. So happy to start off by doing that.
Right. You're a founding member of an activist art collective called the Graphic History Collective. Can you tell our audience a little bit about this and what it's about?
Sure. Well, I'm an academic historian, but I'm also always thinking about how to make history more accessible, how to share the lessons of the past with a larger audience. And so one of the things that I do is partner with artists across the country, across the world, to share the lessons of history through things like graphic novels, graphic histories. That work started for me in 2008 and has continued to this day and has given me the opportunity to produce a number of really exciting projects, collaborate with fantastic artists, including Indigenous artists that perhaps listeners might be familiar with, people like Gord Hill, who wrote the 500 Years of Resistance comic book, or artists like Tanya Willard, Secwepemc artist, and her and I and a colleague, Robin Fulvik, partnered to create a project on Indigenous labor activism in British Columbia, in Vancouver in particular. So that work has allowed me to connect with a lot of people and share, I think, the lessons of the past with a larger audience. And I really appreciate that part of the work that I get to do.
Yeah. You also recently collaborated with Ellen Gabriel from Katsi'tsakwas on her book titled When the Pine Needles Fall, Indigenous Acts of Resistance. Can you please tell our audience about this book and how it came to be and important message it delivers?
Yeah, well, I'm very, very fortunate. I think part of what I learned through the Graphic History Collective is the importance of collaboration and solidarity, right? Working to create things that are bigger than ourselves. Um, and for a long time, I had been working with a magazine called Canadian Dimension, which actually focuses historically has focused a lot on the Indigenous resistance movement in Canada. Um, and at a certain point, I had reached out to Ellen, followed her on social media, and she was doing a lot of activism around ongoing land theft in her community, of Katsi'tsakwas. Um, and so I reached out to her to see if she would be interested in doing an interview to sort of profile and uplift her voice. And we got along really well. She informed me how much of what is going on in that community today has a lot to do with what happened in 1990 around the Mohawk resistance, um, the siege of Katsi'tsakwas and Kahnawake, and how that event in 1990 was actually the product of 300 years of land theft and resistance. And what I had originally thought was going to be a half-hour conversation ended up being much longer, and we continued to build our relationship. And at a certain point, I said, I think, Ellen, have you ever thought about writing a book about everything that you've done? Both in 1990, she was the spokesperson of what is sometimes incorrectly known as the Oka crisis, um, better the Mohawk resistance. Um, and she said, yeah, I have thought about writing a book, but things keep getting in the way. And the things that kept getting in the way were all of the amazing activism that she continues to do. She was after 1990. She is the president of Quebec Native Women. She is, an ongoing, inspirational land defender. She goes to the United Nations to talk about the rights of Indigenous people around the world. And at a certain point, I said, one of the things, perhaps as an ally or a co-conspirator, we could use the power and the privilege that I have as an academic, to spend some of my time to interview you and do the work of creating a book that would allow new generations to learn from Ellen. Not everyone has the opportunity to sit down, and chat with her and learn from her. But through this book, new generations will be able to be inspired by Ellen's love for the land and her dreams for a better future. And so this, project, which just came out in September 2024, published with Between the Lines Press, for me was an absolute honor. To have a series of conversations with someone you look up to, a mentor, and to be able to share those was very humbling, but something that I think hopefully will help new generations learn from Ellen and be inspired by her. And we're very thankful that we've been able to launch the book in her homelands, Montreal. She was here recently in Winnipeg for a big launch and an event, and she's going to a number of other locations, and then we're going to meet up again in Toronto on Friday, November 8th, and then in Vancouver on November 15th for additional events. So it's, I think this book in particular, I do a lot of other work, but this book in particular for me, is something that I'm very proud of. I learned a lot as a result of my relationship with Ellen, which is ongoing. She inspires me with her hope for a better world, and I feel very lucky to be able to share those conversations with others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually, we come from an oral tradition where, back in history, not a lot of people wrote books about, things they've encountered, and how like today's day and age, there's more, more opportunities and more ways of covering our histories. And how has in being with Ellen Gabriel and helping her write the book, how has it changed your perspective about Indigenous people or Mohawks specifically, or how have you changed, being involved in that collaboration?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I think Kim Tallbear, Indigenous Studies scholar at the University of Alberta, always talks about that research with Indigenous people can be transformative, right? That there's this element of standing with allies with other people, and how that can transform um, people. And for me, I learned a lot about Haudenosaunee culture, history, philosophy, the importance of oral storytelling as a way of conveying important pieces of that history, of that culture. I learned a lot about Mohawk language, and the kind of deeply grounded nature of diplomacy and thoughts on treaty, or even just the basic idea that Ellen opens the book with, which is the words that come before all else, right? That before meetings, right? It's an acknowledgement of the interconnected nature of people and the world around us, and that if you don't perform, or if you don't recite the words before all else, decisions at meetings, right, can be rendered not as a consensus, right? It's not thinking about the world and all relations. And all of these different things taught me a lot about how limited Western settler culture is in terms of the way that we approach issues, right? Settlers are so focused on taxes and money and how things are going to benefit them. It's completely disconnected from the world around us, the world that we are interdependent on, right? That the decisions, because they make someone money, or because they're profitable, are deemed positive when they are contributing to the extraction and destruction of the world that we depend on. Like that, Ellen helped me understand in a very, in a very humble way, how destructive some of that thinking is, and how Mohawk approaches to the world actually have a lot to teach everyone, about the ways forward, about ways to reconnect and rebuild relationships, not just between people, but between species, between all our relations. And I think that is important. That's something that I learned a lot by collaborating with Ellen on, and I think is the reason why I feel so proud to have been part of this project of uplifting Ellen's voice, because those are the teachings that we need in this world right now. And I'm trying to learn from Ellen as much as I hope readers who pick up the book will as well.
Allyship. When I say allyship, meaning, I think you know what I mean. Being an ally of Indigenous people. To me, you sound like an ally, and the way you speak, and the things you're involved in, and this book, and your work at the university. It means different things to different people, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are unsure as to. I know there's a lot of good people that want to do good things for Indigenous people, to help Indigenous people, and to
Yeah.
bridge a better understanding. And what's your, like, what would be your definition of allyship, and what would you encourage people to do to be allies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think, I always need to be careful in the role that I play, not to feed into ideas of white saviorhood, right? That the bald white guy like me is going to ride in and save Indigenous people. I critique that at every turn,
Yeah.
and more think of my relationship as a co-conspirator. Um, that I have a role to play in building better and stronger relations,
Mhm.
for a kind of liberation that involves Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I mean, this is the thing that I talk about a lot in my work, is that the colonial condition, right, is of course oppressive for Indigenous people, but it's also harmful for settlers, right, who have to, buy into these kinds of myths around, the dehumanization of Indigenous people, right? That hurts Indigenous people, but it also hurts non-Indigenous people who are perpetuating this dehumanization, right? There's like a degrading of Indigenous people is also a degrading of the self, right? To buy into these racist notions actually is harmful. And so part of the argument here is I talk to non-Indigenous people about the work of, say, reconciliation or decolonization, not as a social cause. It's not something you're doing for Indigenous people. You're trying to work in better relationship with Indigenous people. You have a role to play in that. It doesn't, mean that you get to control all of the decisions, right? Or take all the benefit. Like in any relationship, right? You're trying to be a good partner in that relation. And I've learned a lot. I mean, as I said, I'm from originally out west, and now do a lot of work with the Squamish Nation in particular, about thinking about Squamish perspectives. But I'm also rooted here in Treaty One, and so I've learned a lot about what it means to be a treaty person from a non-Indigenous perspective, right? And I think that treaty understanding, that relationship based thinking, relationality, often is the Indigenous studies way of thinking about this, requires figuring out what is yours to do in the work of building a better relationship. And listening, I realize the irony that I'm here on a podcast talking a lot. Non-Indigenous people like to hog a lot of the airtime, but of course I know that I'm one of just a few non-Indigenous people profiled on this great podcast. But I think it's talking with non-Indigenous people to think, when I talk to non-Indigenous people, they think about Treaty One, treaty is like for Indigenous people. But in reality, treaty is a two-way street. It's a relationship. And if you're not an equal partner to the relationship of making it better and stronger, then you're working in bad relation. You're a bad partner. And I think, being an ally means that you're trying to work on that relationship, trying to figure out what role you can play in strengthening those connections. And so I think, that is ultimately part of what I hope non-Indigenous people can figure out, right? I mean, even if you just look at something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the beginning of that says, that reconciliation is not an Indigenous problem or a burden. It's a Canadian responsibility. So that means that non-Indigenous people have to figure out, okay, what can I do to strengthen this relationship? And I think that is at the core of what allyship can be, which is figuring that out in ways that don't always put the burden on Indigenous people to figure out the solutions to the problems that non-Indigenous people create.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Ayaya songs are about our histories. Ayaya is an Inuit-owned firm that tells our stories in many languages across Canada. They are experts in publishing children's books, usually in syllabics, and they do large multi-language projects like the reports of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. If you need help getting your stories into classrooms or homes in Cree, Inuktitut, or other Indigenous languages, check them out at ayaya.ca. That's ayaya.ca. Ayaya is a proud sponsor of the Roots and Hoots podcast.
It's actually, it's a right step, I think, in the right direction when we can actually have a civil discussion about reconciliation, and we live in a country that allows us to do that without getting into a big confrontation. What I wanted to ask you was about your discussions and about your your talks with non-Indigenous people. Do you ever get into like a confrontation, like a heated discussion or a debate about something that you feel strongly about, and that your whoever you're talking to gets upset and about what you're doing? And do you ever get into like a verbal confrontation
I mean,
about it?
yeah, I mean, I try not to. I think that maybe, part of this is realizing, that in like in any relationship, right, you will have misunderstandings, you will have difference of opinion, differing perspectives.
Right.
Um, but I think part of being a good ally, being a good partner, being in any good relationship is trying to figure out and listen
Mhm.
that if someone is frustrated or angry or disagrees with you, that you need to try to figure out how to get onto the same page, to figure out where they're coming from, to listen rather than always be defensive. Non-Indigenous people, um, myself included, can be quite, nobody likes being critiqued.
Right.
But I think that if we go back to this idea that the goal is to develop better relationships, critique is going to be there, and we need to work to find ways to listen and always have, be very clear about the goal is to develop better relationships. And
Yeah.
so sometimes when you make a mistake, as I do, um, you need to approach it rather than always defending your actions or your
Yeah.
ideas. You
Yeah.
need to find ways to listen and figure
Yeah.
out how you can respond respectfully, of course. But if your goal is to build a better relationship, then, getting into an altercation and, digging in your heels or whatever is not helpful for that.
Right.
So that's a sort of, from Ellen, I've learned a lot about the importance of peace, of diplomacy, of negotiation,
Mhm.
of also just, being, Ellen's life as a land defender is about no compromise in many respects, but it's also about how to collaboratively work with others to advance the cause of justice and peace.
Yeah.
And so I think that Western society is very individualistic. It teaches us to think of ourselves as individuals competing, but that's not, I think, um, that's not a helpful perspective if our goal is to collectively work towards building a better world
Right.
that benefits not just us but all relations. So,
Yeah.
I don't want to, sit here and pretend like I have all of the answers or I get it right all of the time. I don't.
Yeah.
I actually think that modeling that is helpful, perhaps for other listeners.
Mhm.
Um, but that commitment to trying to figure out how to work in better relationship always is the goal.
Right.
um you know the insistence on that, I think, is important.
Yeah. One of the other things that we came across in researching some of the stuff that you do is the thing about denialism that
Right.
you've had to deal with people who've denied, that residential schools existed. And so I guess, I mean, to me, it seems like unbelievable that people still deny that this actually happened when the government's already, accepted it. They know about
Hmm.
it, and and they've actually paid some compensation to students about it. So, how real is the threat? How or is it a threat at all about the denialism of not just about residential schools, but other things in history about Indigenous people?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, okay, I mean, I think in some ways my response to this brings together a lot of what we've talked about, which is, um the other thing that I didn't mention in the first question was that, um I grew up in North Vancouver, not really knowing a lot about Squamish and saber-tooth neighbors. North Vancouver is a very urban, segregated, at times racist place. Um, and I didn't know a lot about, Indigenous history, about ongoing, cultural, and political processes. until my mid-20s when I met my partner whose stepfather was a survivor of the St. Michael's Residential School in Alert Bay. And I learned a lot as he went through the Truth and Reconciliation process, in particular, the independent assessment process. And, I saw the ways that lawyers and other officials would try to undermine his voice, undermine his experience, belittle him in many ways. That the distortion and disbelief was baked into the process. And it got me thinking about why non-Indigenous people have such a hard time believing that Canada was constructed through genocidal policies against Indigenous people. And part of it was also my own experience as a non-Indigenous person. We're taught that Canada is this peaceful, benevolent place, right? Multicultural, tolerant, when for many Indigenous people, the experience of Canada is very different. And I think non-Indigenous people have a hard time believing it. It's like, my experience of Canada is so great, I have a hard time believing that this could have happened. And I saw this again when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report was released, that a lot of Canadians responded in positive ways, that they did not learn about this, that they took the knowledge to heart, and they figured out ways that they could use the truth to support reconciliation. I do believe that the vast majority of Canadians want to do that, even if they don't know exactly how.
I agree.
But there are some that saw truth and reconciliation as a threat to their power, their privilege, their profit, as colonizers, right? They internalized the myths of benevolence and peacekeeping, but also they internalized, the racist logic that their superiority was justified on Indigenous deficiency and the dehumanizing nature of racism, etc. They believe in that desperately, and as a result, it leads them to think of reconciliation as something that needs to be resisted. And at first, we saw people like Senator Lynn Bayek in 2017. She was a senator. She made a speech in the House of Commons that essentially, defended residential schools as being well-intentioned. It was of the times, abuses being exaggerated, deaths didn't happen, or they were unavoidable, all of these kinds of talking points. And I wrote an article that basically deconstructed all of these points and showed how they were part of this strategy called denialism, which is not actually restricted to residential schools. Denialism is used in all sorts of contexts, from climate change denialism, right. To science denialism. It's a way of trying to undermine public confidence in something, right, and open the door to more controversial views. And in this case, residential school denialists are not outright denying that the residential school system happened, or even that it had some negative effects. What they're trying to do is always distort, misrepresent, twist certain facts, minimize, downplay, always, as a way of protecting the status quo and the power and privilege they draw from that. And so I think what we are seeing is, since the 2021 Kamloops announcement about potential unmarked graves, evidence being found, we have seen a sharp increase in residential school denialism, right? We are seeing academics publishing outright mis and disinformation as a way of legitimizing hatred against Indigenous people, of undermining the voices of survivors, of questioning the work that communities are doing. We are seeing, as a result of that, we are seeing, the Kamloops Nation had people show up in the middle of the night with shovels demanding that they be allowed to dig to have proof, or this was just all a big lie or a hoax. That kind of stuff is extremely dangerous. Here in Winnipeg, just to give you an example, because sometimes we think of this as like, it's just, mean things that right-wing people say on the internet. But the problem is that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And in Winnipeg recently, and again, this is difficult subject matter for listeners, so I'll try to be careful. But in Winnipeg here, we recently had a serial killer who was targeting Indigenous women, and when the police arrested him and grasped control of his social media, the only anti-Indigenous post that he was making was spreading the mass grave hoax conspiracy theory and residential school denialism, right? Yeah. And so, I think we need to understand that the threat of residential school denialism is growing. It is being used as a tool to bully and silence Indigenous survivors in particular, but Indigenous communities and nations generally, to sow doubt in the public's mind, right? Truth and reconciliation, they will argue, is a grift. It is a conspiracy to make Canadians feel bad about something that there's no evidence for. When in reality, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was really clear. It used church and state records, right, to establish the truth. Like we know that based on those records, more than 4,000 children died in those schools. We have the House of Commons unanimously acknowledging the system as genocidal. We've had the Pope come and apologize and acknowledge it as genocide. And yet there are right-wing people who are making a lot of money by publishing books and articles that people click on, talking about, can we really believe this? They're asking for evidence of things that we already have evidence for, not because they're curious, right? Not because they've thought of a loophole. They're making money off of spreading and disinformation as a strategy, and I do think that it is dangerous and that it is growing, and that in particular non-Indigenous people need to figure out ways of learning how to identify and confront it as part of the work that we can take on, because this is largely a non-Indigenous issue that is hurting people that we are supposed to be in building better relationships with. So we need to take on that work so that Indigenous people who, and communities are doing a lot of hard work to learn the truth about their, family members' experiences in these schools still. And yet now they also have to deal with all of this denialism. I think that non-Indigenous people have a role to confront that part, so that communities can focus on doing the work that they need to do to support healing and justice for their communities.
Yeah, I think Indigenous communities are really focusing on, just their communities and trying to survive, and with all the things that they have to go through. I don't know if they really can spend much time, fighting denialism, when they all know it, everybody knows that these things did happen. I wanted to ask you about Bill C-14 Bill C-413, which is I believe it's a bill that's going through the House of Commons. If it hasn't gone through yet, and it would make it a crime to condone, deny, justify, or minimize the facts about residential schools. But it goes beyond that though, right? Like if you say this bill C-413, maybe explain a little bit about what it does, what it's supposed to do, its purpose.
Yeah. Well, this is a private member's bill introduced by Leah Gazan from representing here in Winnipeg. And though I am not a legal mind or expert, so I'll preface my comments on from that perspective. I'm a historian, an Indigenous Studies scholar, but from my understanding of the bill, what it does is it adds residential school denialism to already existing legislation about hate speech. Currently in Canada, Holocaust denialism is considered in the same way. So it's adding residential school denialism in the same way that to face the same kinds of consequences that those who deny the Holocaust or minimize the Holocaust. In actual fact, a lot of Holocaust deniers, which perhaps your listeners will be more familiar with hearing about, most Holocaust deniers are actually denialists. That is, they're not saying that the Holocaust never happened. What they do is they try and minimize or downplay, right? Quibble with numbers. Is it 6 million or is it 4 million?
Right.
And I think it's been very well established from Germany to around the world how devastating Holocaust denialism can be. And so I think what this bill does is it situates residential school denialism alongside Holocaust denialism as a kind of hate speech, as a harmful expression of hatred. And I think that many survivors are asking for this kind of legislation. The special interlocutor on unmarked and missing graves, Kimberly Murray, who's going to be releasing a report next week, I believe has come out in favor of this legislation as a way of demonstrating to Canadians, right, that this kind of genocide denialism is similarly problematic to something like Holocaust denialism. And I mean, I think my understanding about the Holocaust legislation is that it actually has not been very successful. It's very difficult to prosecute people as a result. And one of my concerns as a historian is that oftentimes people look to the state as a way of abdicating their personal responsibility for certain things, right? We live in a representative democracy. We vote for people to take on our issues. Right. But as a result, we end up sort of giving away a lot of our power. And so what I've been saying is that regardless of whether this bill passes or not, I think we need to continue to be prepared to deal more effectively with denialism in our interpersonal relationships. If we're waiting for the government to solve denialism, I think we're going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
And we need to find ways, and I say we here to non-Indigenous people in particular, we need to find ways to have difficult conversations with family, friends, coworkers, people on our hockey teams, people, in our communities. We need to learn how to identify those residential school denialist talking points, the things that denialists use, and we need to be able to confidently confront them. That's going to take some work on our part. That's an educative process that's going to work out over time. It's not going to be a be all end all easy fix with a piece of legislation that if it doesn't get adopted, then we'll have to do that work. If it gets adopted, we're still going to have to do that work. And so I think that that's sort of my approach on this. Survivors have asked for it. The special interlocutor has supported it. But we, regardless of what happens, we need to be prepared to take on the challenge of doing this work, of challenging denialism, or else it's going to continue to grow as a very harmful form of discourse. And I think we should be finding ways to have conversations with people we love and care about if we're wanting to build better relations. That denialism is going to help keep us stuck in the colonial cul-de-sac. And so for those of us wanting to get out and to figure out a better way forward, confronting denialism is going to be an important piece of that work.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Ayaya songs are about our histories. Ayaya is an Inuit-owned firm that tells our stories in many languages across Canada. They are experts in publishing children's books, usually in syllabics, and they do large multi-language projects like the reports of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. If you need help getting your stories into classrooms or homes in Cree, Inuktitut, or other Indigenous languages, check them out at ayaya.ca. That's ayaya.ca. Ayaya is a proud sponsor of the Roots and Hoots podcast.
Yeah. Just going back to something you touched on earlier, and it's often heard about, but I think a lot of people really don't understand what treaties are about and where they come from, why they originated. Without I know we're kind of tight for time. Without just to give our audience a bit of an understanding of what the purpose of the treaties were, and what is a treaty, like what is a treaty, and what were their purposes for? What was the purpose of a treaty?
Yeah, I mean, you got another couple hours, we could really get into it.
That's what I
So
said. I
I'll
know
give you the,
it's a
I'll
big
give you
subject, so it's
yeah,
just give us like a brief on what they are and what their purpose was for. I know
yeah,
there are different treaties across Canada, and for different purposes, right? They
sure.
serve different purposes.
Yep.
Uh, but there's also modern day treaties that with the Inuit, for example, land claims settlements. Those are kind of
Yeah.
modern day treaties, but they're not called treaties. So just summarize like what your thoughts are on what treaties.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll give you the shortest answer I can.
We'll
We'll
call you
try and do,
back
well,
when
yeah,
we'll call you
exactly.
back for another session.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Fine. Well, I mean, treaties are an important thing.
But they're not being
And
upheld by the government.
well, this is it. Okay, so
Okay.
let me explain quickly. Um, I learned a lot from Ellen about a different way of thinking about treaty, right? That treaty, um, is really about agreements to work in better relationship with other people, but also Leanne Simpson has often talked about treaties between people and all relations, right? Interspecies treaty, working to make sure if I'm going to build something here, it's not going to negatively affect the beavers or the birds or the fish, right? Again, trying to think about our actions differently. So I mean, I think that has affected a lot of the way that I think about treaty. Um, but if we're thinking about nation to nation treaties, one of the things that Ellen talked to me about was the kind of about the two row wampum, right? This kind of idea of wampum and nation to nation agreements, first between Indigenous nations, and then how this idea of two nations working side by side, not trying to take over one another, right? But sort of a mutually beneficial, a parallel understanding, right?
Yeah, mutual understanding, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And how this idea kind of gets woven into peace and friendship treaties, things like the Royal Proclamation, which gets affirmed in 1764, and the Treaty of Niagara, which then kind of forms the foundation of what is supposed to be nation to nation treaties between the British and then eventually Canada and Indigenous nations. This idea of working together, of nation to nation. Maybe your listeners have heard of this, right? A lot of this comes out of this period of treaty making in the 17 and 1800s. But a lot of people will know treaties from the numbered treaty era, right?
Right.
From 1870s to the early 20th century, and this actually, while they are treaties, they're also somewhat different, right? The Canadian representatives thought of using that nation to nation framework, right? Essentially not in a peace and friendship working mutually beneficial. They saw it as a way of gaining access to land and territory. They
Right.
were using treaty as a way of promising one thing and delivering another. And then actually, as you alluded to there, not even delivering the few promises that were actually made. So that the numbered treaties often have a complicated relationship. Some people appreciate that they exist and they want to work within that framework to try and improve them. Others will point out the sort of disingenuous nature in which those treaties were negotiated as a tool of colonization. And so, as a newly, um, treaty person, I try and learn and listen as much as possible to figure out, what do we do with things like the numbered treaties. My feeling is that, at least in the current context, that there's something that we can point to say that Canada at one point did promise to do better than it has. And that, I also take to heart this idea that treaties were not a one and done kind of thing, like sign your name to this piece of paper and that's it. It was supposed to be an ongoing relationship. So, here in Treaty One, there are problems, there are issues. Well, that treaty was supposed to be continuously updated and negotiated, right? The $5 promises in many of these numbered treaties from the 1870s haven't been updated in 140, 50 years. And
is there no recourse for people to sign these treaties to bring these treaties up to date? Is there
well,
no?
I mean, there are, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there are treaty commissioners, offices of the treaty commissioners trying to figure out what ways perhaps treaties can be both better implemented and perhaps updated as a foundation for those better relationships to continue. But one of the things is that, of course, Canada benefits from not doing that.
Yeah, of course.
They benefit from the way that things are and are quite resistant, to renegotiate the terms of their relationship, even though they promised that would be part of what this process would look like. So I think treaty in the context of the numbered treaties right now, they're imperfect frameworks, and I think that they have strengths and they have limitations, but that ultimately, what to do with the treaties is not my conversation. It's something that I would work with my treaty partners in figuring out how might I better advocate for a better way forward. But I think that's the short answer of treaties is that they have positive elements, right? That there is something that we can point to, that two-row wampum, right, is supposed to represent this mutually beneficial relationship. But what Canada has delivered is the opposite of that, right? It is trying to take over other nations, subordinate them for their own benefit. I think that we can perhaps point to that two-row wampum as a model of something that we might aspire to, whether we work within the frameworks that we have to get there. I think that's a bigger conversation, but it is there as a pattern, as something that we can look to, and perhaps find ways to work towards.
There better not be denialism there. There probably is. I got a couple more questions, and one of the things that I've come across recently, and is a thing called the Indian Trust Fund. And now, I did do a little bit of research on it. To me, it doesn't exist anymore. It used to be money that was set aside by the government to improve housing and other stuff for Indigenous First Nations people in particular. I think that's what it was aimed at, that audience. And but in doing the research, I found that it does not no longer exist. Did it? And it existed at one time, but it's now, I don't know, maybe you know more about it than I do.
Yeah, well, I do know that the Yellowhead Institute, for any of your listeners out there, they did an interesting report on the Indian Trust Fund, right, which is this account that holds all the monies collected, received, and held by the Crown for use and benefit of First Nations. Much of this money was generated as a part of the kind of treaty process of signing treaties. Indigenous people would agree to move to reserves. Then these lands would be surveyed and sold, and the money would go into this trust fund that would be used to pay for things like treaty and other policies, including residential schools, right? This money that was generated through the process of colonization would be used to continue the process of colonization.
Yeah.
And if I remember from their report, the fund is now sort of absorbed into the Consolidated Revenue Fund.
Right.
So it doesn't exist as the Indian Trust Fund anymore, but that money didn't disappear. And the ways in which those resources were used to support nation building, continued settler colonialism, actually, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this way. And we need to remember that often colonization is justified in terms of, Christianity, in terms of, the benevolence of the British Empire, et cetera, et cetera. But at the core of it is making money, of gaining access to resources and territories, to be able, to generate profit. And so I think more attention needs to be paid to that particular part, not only historically of the colonial project, but also today. And that's why we see so many government decisions being favorable to resource companies, like whether we're thinking about fracking in New Brunswick, or we're talking about oil and gas in Alberta and British Columbia, right? A lot of these decisions, but also the resistance by Indigenous land defenders, right? It all comes down to, Canada is a settler capitalist society, right? That profit making was always at the core of why they wanted Indigenous peoples as, territory
Is this
and
tied to,
resources.
would this be tied to this way of thinking of extracting resources and making money? Is this in any way tied to the doctrine of discovery?
Well, I mean, I think the doctrine of discovery emerges alongside the development of new kinds of European economic practices that eventually lead to capitalism. I mean,
Right.
we sometimes we problematize colonialism, but we don't talk about capitalism as being intricately woven, right? I mean, as Europe was expanding, through colonization, they were also expanding their economic system that they were establishing and spreading around the world. We talk about the expansion of empires as a bad thing, but world markets as good things, when in reality those are intricately interconnected processes that have done a lot of harm. I mean, going back to the project with Ellen, we talk about the 1990 Mohawk resistance. What were they resisting? The expansion of a golf course and the building of luxury condos, right, over sacred pines, and a Mohawk burial ground. Why do they want to do that? Because they were going to make money. And imagine the audacity, to destroy sacred forest and build a golf course and condos over marked grave. I mean, I think that because Canadians buy into the myths that the building of Canada was this process of benevolence, they don't understand that violence and greed at the core of much of that settler capitalist project, both historically and today, right? That those pressures are still there. And I think that we need to talk about that more as we discuss what our future looks like. If we continue to exploit the natural world around us for our own profit, it's going to be very difficult to leave a future, for our children and for the next 7 generations, right? We risk that. So as a result, we have to have a wider vision of what this looks like. If we're just sacrificing the future for profit today, I don't think we are working in good relationship with the world that we depend on around us.
Well said. I wanted to ask you just one more question. What is your hope for reconciliation in Canada? We all want this country to, I think everybody agrees that this country, we could improve on it by, having a better policies toward Indigenous people. And what is your feeling about the reconciliation in Canada?
Yeah, well, I'll try and end on a hopeful note. I am a hopeful person.
Okay.
I think I'll go back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission,
Right.
because if you look and look at their final report, they're very clear, right? Their argument is that we need to have truth about the past,
Mhm.
and from truth will come healing, and healing will lead to justice, and justice will lead to reconciliation. Okay.
Yep.
And I mean, denialists know that, which is why they're always trying to quibble with the truth to close off the pathway to healing and justice and reconciliation. But I honestly believe that they are losing. That's why they're getting more desperate. They know that Canadians increasingly are learning the truth, right? That they are trying to develop better relationships. Um, and so, just as an example, maybe to leave your listeners with some hope as to why I think we are making a difference and that this is changing over time for the better. My neighbor is a librarian at a elementary school, and she recently invited me to read to a grade 5-6 class for I Love to Read month. You kind of go and you read and teach them about why reading is so great. Um, and I was reading. I chose to read from a book called Fatty Legs, which is about an Inuit girl's experience. And before I read from the book, I ask them, what do they know about residential schools? And if that were me 20 years ago, I would say nothing, right? I'd be very resistant. And this kid puts up his hand at the back, and I'm thinking, okay, where's this going to go? I hope I didn't, create a bad environment here. And the kid puts up his hand, and he's like, well, residential schools were a church and government project for over 100 years to remove Indigenous children from their families, to uproot their cultures. It's created a lot of damage. That's why we have Truth and Reconciliation today. We actually just had an elder come last week talking about, what we can do to build better relationships. And I thought, why am I here? Like this kid I was
Yeah.
I was afraid to wear jeans because I couldn't figure out how to do up my the belt there. I was still wearing sweatpants in grade 5 and 6, and this kid's got the basics of
Yeah.
reconciliation down pat. And I
Yeah.
think that gave me a lot of hope, right? That
Yeah.
I had to learn everything, right? I had to
Yeah.
work really hard to change my perspective on the world, to build those different kinds of relationships. And I think that young people today, and I'm not trying to say that there are not issues and that there's not a lot of work to be done, but I honestly believe that people having the exposure to that, being brought into and invited into the work of trying to build better relationships to create a better, more honorable future, you know, I believe that is going to win the day, right? Murray Sinclair always says, education is what got us into this mess. Education is what's going to get us out. And that as a just one example gives me a lot of hope that is going to win the day. We just need to be persistent, and continue to build that momentum behind putting truth before reconciliation.
Awesome. Well said. We need more guys like Sean Carleton as allies in this world, in this country. Thank you very much, Sean, for taking the time to do this. And on behalf of the Legacy Hope Foundation, I thank you. Thank you very much for your time again today.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much, Gordon. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Roots and Hoots is a podcast project produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation. For episode show notes, please visit the podcast description and make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. For more information about the work we do, please visit legacyofhope.ca.